Hello and welcome. In this short video, I want to show you how to work with the new feature inside of 3D Studio Max called Max Liquid. And this stuff is very good, and I think that it's very good news that we have some liquid simulation inside of 3D Studio Max without any extra plugins. Because only tool we had for that is Phoenix FD. I like this tool, I like that plugin. I already have had some lesson from that. But it's always good when we have some tools built in, and till this moment we have like a PR flow for some particle simulation, and that's it. So if you need some atmospheric effect, we need to add film effects of Phoenix FD for liquid simulation, Phoenix FD for destruction. Definitely need something like sinker particles or a Ray-Fi tool. So all those tools are plugins actually, so we need to buy them. And in this moment, we have the Max Liquid tool, which will allow us to create a liquid simulation. In fact, this is like a Bifrost in Maya. Actually, this is our Bifrost solver, and I hope that this tool will be good for some simulations. And it will be a powerful tool for the liquids inside of 3D Studio Max, because I like liquid simulation, I like to use a real flow, I like to use the Phoenix and Houdini stuff, but it's always good when you have some extra tool for that. So what we can do with this? If we create a Max Liquid icon, in fact it's not just an icon, we have this little sphere which is an emitter. So we can define the radius of this sphere, which is I want to use like a 3 meters, and we have the icon. Actually, icon just an icon. So definitely, if I want to look on that, I just rotate. Rotate it like here. So now we have this little icon. Make it a little bit lower, and paste it here on the top of my geo. And with the geo I have this nice, some river or stream, which is I want to make liquid flowing here. And this pretty simple geo I created. And what I want to do, in fact, to make our simulation, make our first simulation, we need to open our simulation view here. So there is just an emitter settings. We can change it to box, plane, or some custom object. I want to use the sphere by default. Just paste it here somewhere. And let's look on our simulation view. We have many different settings here. We have many tabs. Actually, we have a liquid attributes, solver parameters, caching, display settings, and render settings stuff. So what I want to do, before I create my scene, I want to add a geometry into my scene. So by default, any geometry we have inside of our scene, this geometry will not have an effect or influence in our liquid simulation. So to add some colliding geo in our simulation, we need to paste this geometry inside of colliders list. So we have a colliders and kill plane, and I want to add my geometry to my simulation. So I press pick a ground object, and then press this stuff. So now we have this inside of list. And if I press the start button here, our solver O1, that's our solver, this is our emitter, and it takes some time for start, and it will begin. All right, so now we see the fluid. So, and to look at our simulation, how it's going on there, we need to define how many frames I already have calculated. So there is no automatic update on timeline with the simulation. So in fact, if I wanted to look on my sim, I want to see, I need to find how many frames I already sim. Also, okay, cache contains 13 frames, so I'm going to frame 13, and we have some simulation done. So we don't have the automatic update, which is fine. Each time I want to see how many frames I already simmed, I can here just go to my icon solid liquid component, and I can see how many frames I already have. Another stuff, I can look at my caching folder. So the first thing I want to show you how this liquid tool works with the cache. So the first thing we need to define that we have the project folder. Inside of my project, I have the project folder, which is here. It's my CDMax liquid folder. And if I go into there, this is my CDMax liquid. I have the sim cache folder, which created by this simulation tool. By default, we have this nice folder hierarchy. So by default, we have a sim cache folder. Inside of that, we're going to have a folder with the scene name, and then we have a folder with object name, and then we have a folder with solver name. So we have the object, call it liquid 001, and we have the solver, call it solver 01. So if I go to my folder, go to sim cache, I have some tests already here. So I have my scene name. If you look on that, liquid test 02 version 01. If I go to this folder, we have a name of our object name, our liquid 001. Inside of that, we have a solver name. So I leave my names by default. I don't want to rename this stuff, so you easily can find the files in your project. And go inside of solver, we have a few folders inside of that. This is solids and voxel liquid. So by default, we create just a liquid simulation. We have a 3 little button here on the right side, and you have the solver, and they can turn on our simulation. So first button is turning on our main solid solve liquid simulation. The next button create a form, and the last one create a mesh component. So each time you want to create some form stuff or mesh based on your liquid simulation, you can press those buttons and you can create all those elements at once. But in fact, it's not a very good idea, because if we create all those 3 elements in one time, it will take too many time for calculating. So in many programs with the simulation, with liquid simulation such as RealFlow, Rini, Max, anyway, we can divide all our simulation in a few stages. So in one stage, we create the core liquid sim, like we doing here. And when we have already cached this stuff, we can add some secondary particles like a foam, splashes, and etc. So we will create those splashes using the already calculated cached files with liquid. And when we have the liquid scene, when we have the splash scene, we can create the mesh for the visualization. So we can divide our simulation into 3 different stages. And like here, we have 3 different options. So first stuff we need to create is our main core liquid scene. After that, we can just turn off the simulation, turn on the form, and using this cache we already have, we can create the form. It allows us to save many resources, because I don't need to create the form if I don't have a nice liquid sim. I want to do a few tests for the liquid simulation, and when I'm good with this simulation, I can say, okay, this sim is good. So I turn off my liquid sim, and now let's talk about the form. Okay, I create a form, I turn off my form, all right, I can create a mesh and begin a visualization. So if you're talking about the caching files, we can go here inside of voxel liquid. This is folder containing all files for our liquid cache. If I want to update it by the time changing, we have the last frame here. So basically, I prefer to use this folder to look what is the last frame cached in my liquid simulation. So if you look on that, it's like a 142. So I can go here and look on my sim how it looks here. So I can stop it for a moment. I already see that we have some liquid, we have some particles inside of that. And if we go into solver again, I have the folder with the solids. So inside of this folder, we're going to have all our volume objects inside of our simulation. So basically, our simulation is not a particle sim. It's the grid simulation, because we use some voxels for the simulation, and all those particles are going through those objects. So each time you add some geo inside of your simulation, like we did with the ground object, it will convert this geometry into voxels, into volume objects, and it will cache those objects too. So you already see that we have the solid volume, which is actually have the same amount, the same size, because we don't have any kind of animation or something like that, morphing or something. We have the static geometry for that. So, if we go into caching, we can define where we want to put those cache files. By default, we have the project folder, user project folder, and we have inside of here my 3ds Max Liquid folder, we have the scenes, my different version, and we have the sim cache. Basically, sometimes we can use our project folder to create some simulations and put those cache files inside of that. But sometimes we can use different hard drives to allow us to write those files into those hard drives. In fact, I have two different hard drives which is called cache, X and Y. And I prefer to write cache files in those drives. I don't like to save my cache in the same folder. We just have in the same folder with the scenes. So because it takes too many place, actually, it have a big size with the cache files. So what we can do with this? Before we continue with the caching, I want to go to some display settings because I want to see how my simulation look like. And by default, we have these huge squares. It's not very present. So I'm going to display settings, and here we can find some liquid settings and form settings. So we don't have any form for now, so I just turn off this stuff. Let's look on our liquid settings. What do we have here? We have a display type by default is point. We can choose like a sphere or planes. Sphere is pretty nice. It's more look like a mesh or something like that. But I prefer to use the points. We have two different mesh types, but we're going to talk about those stuff a little bit later. And now we go to point, but I want to change this point size because by default they have a big squares and it's not very good to look how many particles I have and overall looking of my sim. So I'm going to size 0.1, and this is a little bit better. Now I can see how many particles I have inside of my simulation, visualize that, and I can look on my particle count here. So inside of 142 frames, I have a 61,000 particles. Well, by default, we have this master voxel size 0.5. This means that one voxel of our grid have the size of 0.5. And if you look on this, let's go to frame 0, somewhere here, where you are. We have a very tiny box here. I need to increase, oh, here we go. I just want to turn off my geo. Here we have our grid. So if I increase voxel size, we can look on this grid and see how it works. So all my simulation is creating inside of this volume. So it's just representation. It's just, this box is not our grid actually. It's just visualizing what size of our voxels. In fact, when we create a simulation, you see this little box? We are gonna have the big container which have the voxels inside, and those voxels by default have the size of 0.5 as we have here. So the less voxel size, the more cells we have inside of this container and the more particles we have inside of our simulation. So now we have 61,000 particles in frame 142 or 147. And we have 62,000 particles here. So let's talk about some particle settings here. We have the color grading here using the vorticity by default, and it's stuck at that the brighter particles, the more vorticity it has inside of it. So we can see that we have many different channels for each particles. We have a curvature, density, position, droplets, velocity, and vorticity. By default, we have vorticity, but I prefer to use velocity channel to look on my particles, which particles have the more velocities, which have the less velocities. So the brighter particle, we have more velocity, the darker particle, less velocity. We can change those colors if you want, but I prefer to use those, blue tones. And we have different opacity and size channels. So we already have some size changing. So by default, we have a 1. I change this to 0.1. And we have a static channel, so by default all particles have the same size. If I press 0.1, this means that all particles have the size 0.1. But we can use different channels to define the size of the particle. Let's say I want to set up the density, and the more density particle have, the bigger size of this particle. So that it is not very represented. I don't know, it's something new for me. I prefer to look on some color grades, and it's a little bit difficult to understand this density if I'm using the particle size, but it's definitely a good feature, and I think that sometimes it can be helpful. So you can definitely use that. The same stuff is opacity. We can change opacity of each particle using some channels here, but I prefer to use the static for the opacity and size. So I have the same opacity and the same size for each particle, and using the velocity for colorizing those particles. So if you go back to solver parameters, we can find here some parameters like a frame range. So by default, I have 1000 here, the big frame range for my liquid simulation, because it takes some time to fill this pool here with the liquid and to have a nice liquid simulation here. So you see that we have already calculated 147 frames, and it's still not going to our lower part of geometry. So we can use your open timeline, so we can define the frame range for simulation. By default, we use the timeline of our project, and we have some system scale, which is very important stuff. So in fact, I have the 1 unit like 1 meter. And if you go to customize unit setup, we have the system unit setup, we have 1 unit and 1 meter, and I use the meter settings here. So this geometry is pretty big. So if you look here, I'm going to like standard primitives and create, I don't know, like a box. Go to front view and make it a box with the height of this. So it's like more than 80 meters high. So it's pretty big geometry, and this simulation is gonna look like a very big liquid volume. So it's like a waterfall or something like that, or some part of the rocky river, and etc. So we can change the system scale here. So if we can uncheck the use system scale, we can define how many inches, meters, feet, miles, millimeters, and etc. we are going to use for the simulation. So if I change to inches, now we can see how big our simulation was. So this our geometry with the inches units, and this our simulation with the meters. So basically I like to use our meters. We can change it a little bit later to compare different result with different scale setup. And we have the solver properties. So the main stuff here is a master voxel size. So as I told you, the less voxel size we have, the more cells we have inside of container, and as effect, we're gonna have the more particles with the simulation. All right, and we have the gravity magnitude, which allow us to define which is gravity we're gonna have inside of our simulation. By default, in many programs, you can see that we have the gravity like 9.8. So this is physically based gravity. And in fact, if you want to define what these parameters can do, we can, just put cursor here, and we can we have little subscription or little text here what this parameter doing, and little explanation. So what I want to do, I just want to create this the default simulation. So I don't want to change nothing here and make simulation, and I want to look what is the result, and then I need to change something to create a more better simulation result. But before I do this, I want to add another one object. I want to add some kill planes here. So the thing is, during our simulation, some particles will go out from my geometry. Sometimes it can happen like a leaking, and now you see here that some particles are going through geometry and just fall down. The thing is, if we create the grid sim and actually this is our voxel simulation with the container. So some particles can fall down here on a huge distance. There is no limits, so each particles can, you know, going down without any limitation. And for the themes program, we'll create the huge container, you know, so we're gonna spend many resources to simulate those falling droplets, those falling particles. To avoid this, we can create the kill plane stuff we can create the kill plane actually geometry to delete particles which will fall down in some areas, in some level. So to do that, I create a plane, align this plane to my object, Alt A, and put it underneath of this geometry and make it a little bit bigger, like, I don't know, 600 by 600. So maybe not too much, maybe 400 square. I think that will be enough. I don't expect that those particles will jump out like this. So this is going to be my kill geo, something like that, or kill plane, it doesn't matter how you call this. And I want to add this kill geo to my kill planes window here. So press pick, select my kill geo, and now all particles which will fall down here underneath of this geometry will be killed. All right, they go into the surface and they will die. To avoid some troubles with the render, I uncheck the renderable and maybe display as a box to make, you know, this thing invisible. All right, so now I want to create a simulation by default steps, and I already have the cache for this simulation. And what I want to do, I want to change my caching stuff here. So before I do this, I want to show you something about our solver settings. And if we go in here to like start solve, each time we're gonna have some run options. What we could do, we can resume our simulation, we can restart our simulation, or we can cancel and do nothing. So if you want to resume simulation, press this button. Again, we have some fluid, and okay, if we won't change nothing here, we will resume our simulation. So the main thing is, if we change something like master voxel size or something like that, we definitely need to restart our simulation. In my case, I'm doing nothing here, so we can definitely resume our simulation, and we can stop it, we can pause it, and you know, play it again, and it will not ask nothing, it just resume. All right, in my case, I will stop this stuff, and I want to look on my different caches. I already have some prepared cache files inside of my cache folder, cache drive actually. I have a folder called Max Liquid. So in my situation, I prefer to put all my caches from different plugins, programs into one or two different hard drives, because cache is a pretty big amount of space. So if you go into sim cache, we see some different results. So I already have some simulation from this scene, and I want to show you with different settings, with different parameters, different voxel size, etc. So if you look on the size of this cache, it's definitely, I think it's more than 300 gigabytes or something like that. So it's a big amount of files, big amount of gigs. It's a huge volume. It takes some time, so make a pause. All right, so we have more than 300 gigabytes. It's just 4 or 5 different simulations with different particles amount and some stuff. So definitely how I can change my cache folder, I want to drag my simulation from this version liquid test 02 version 02. How I can do that? In fact, inside of this cache, I have my basic simulation. So this is default sim. We have the 848 frames already simulation, so already pre-cached files. So if I want to change my project folder, I just uncheck here, use project folders, and go here, go to Y, go to Max Liquid, and press select folder. So as you can see, inside of folder max liquid, I have the sim cache folder. This means that we start with this sim cache folder. And then we have the scene name, we have the object name, and the solver name. So as you already know. So now what I can do, the thing is our project name, our scene name actually is liquid test 02 version 01. So what I could do, I can rename my scene here to version 02. It will automatically update cache. Let's see. Save as. I just put a new folder calling lesson. So I did want to rewrite those file called lesson and save it like a version 02. Press save. And now when I have the name of my scene the same as the name of this folder, liquid test 02 version 02, I can drag my timeline here and we have our sim. So it takes some time to upload that. Well, in fact, I have a little bit different position for my meter, but it doesn't matter for me, so we can put it over here. I did want to spend some time for calculation stuff because it takes a while. If you go into the folder, we can see how many times it takes for calculating. So it's begin with in 5:02 and till almost same. So it's less than 2 hours it's take for calculating, so it's not too much. In fact, how many particles we have in the last frames? We're gonna have how many frames here? Go to display settings. We have something like 300,000 particles. So this is not a big amount, in fact, because if we want to have nice liquid surface, we have nice details, we definitely need to increase the particle amount. So this is just a default simulations, and I want to show you a little preview. This is our default sim. It's just with a bigger particle size. And what we can see here, well, depending on the size of or actually scale of our scene, this liquid is moving very slow. In fact, yes, if we keep in mind that we have the height of this geometry is like in 80 meters, this liquid is pretty huge volume, yeah, and depending on the scale, the liquid is moving with the different velocities. So if we have a big scale, the less liquid speed. With the lower scale, we have a bigger speed for liquid. But in this case, what I want to do, I want to change some stuff. Well, the first stuff I want to change is definitely need to create a little bit less cell size. But what I want to do, I want to work with some geometries. We can see that some particles are sliding in the geosurface because we almost don't have any friction or stickiness to geometry, which is not very good in real world. If we have some rocky background, not geometry, the ground or something like that, and we have a liquid which is falling on that, it's like have some friction, so liquid is stick on those surfaces. It's not like an ice or something like that, but we have like an, you know, it's already done doesn't have a friction at all. In my case, this is like a rocky stuff, so I need to add some friction here, so particles need to stick on the surface. And what we can do with this, the first step, I want to go to my solver parameters, and we can find the master voxel size here. So with the size of 0.5, we can use the lower voxel size, like, I don't know, 0.35 or something like that, to add more particles to our simulation. But if you look here, we have many different parameters. So except of the simulation parameters, we have the liquid parameters. We're going to talk about those parameters in the next lesson when we're going to talk about the viscosity and some surface tension stuff. We have the emitter object parameters, which allow us to set up our emitter. So we can define, we have container or emitter, and we have the emitter objects list here. We have just one of those, just a sphere. We have many attributes like density and expansion rate, etc. But here we have some useful parameters in our situation is called stickiness. And we have a strength and bandwidth. So in fact, the strength is how this liquid, with what strength this liquid we're gonna stick into our surface. So I'm going to put like 0.5. So the bigger value here, the more sticky strands we're going to have from our particles. So it will stick to our geometry. The bigger amount, it will stick more. Now we have a bandwidth which allows us to set up the depths of this influence. So we have some parameters, some particles which hit the surface. In fact, though there is no any heating, so none of those particles will not hit actually the surface. They always going on some distance to geometry, yeah, because we have some moving for those particles, and we have some sub-steps which allow us to calculate this moving. So we have, if we have particles hit the surface, it will not calculate it, the heating like in real world. Mostly in all program from liquid simulation, we have some distance with we have some gap between the geometry and the liquid. So if we look on bandwidth, we need to define the depths of this influence. So if you put like 0.5 units here, that means that we have the depth of 0.5. Now those particles which will be on the distance of 0.5 from the surface will have the thickness 0.5. So let's talk about some interesting parameters inside of simulation is the steps. It's very useful stuff, and we're going to talk about this in just a few minutes. So what is the steps? We have a different steps. We have a time step and we have the transport steps. So very interesting parameter allow us to define the steps for our simulation. What does it mean? And actually all those particles we have inside of our sim moving with different velocities. So some of those particles, when we look at our lower simulation, we have some particles in this bottom pool. They have pretty low velocities, so they're not moving too much. But some of those particles, like here, we have a bigger velocities. As we can see here, we have the color velocity channel, so the brighter particles, the more velocity we have. And the thing is, if the particle is moving with a big speed, sometimes this particle can go through the geometry. And this causes some strange stuff like leaking. We have here, but it's no leaking for now. We can see there. And why it's happening? If we have like one step per frame, so let's say this particle is moving from this position in this frame, and it will be here on the next frame. Okay, so it has a very big speed. And if we have some geometry and this particle need to collide with this geometry, if we have just one step per one frame, in one frame this particle will be before this surface, and in the next frame it will be behind this surface. So if we will have just one frame per one step per one frame, it will not collide, because your program will not react on that. But in our transport step, we have the minimum and maximum transport steps for those particles. So the more velocities have the particle, the more steps we have for calculating this particle movement in each frames. So if we have the static particles which have very low speed, we don't need to divide one frame calculation into many steps. So we don't need to spend our resources for that. But when we have the particle which is moving with a big velocity, with a big speed, we definitely need to divide one simulation frame into many different steps to create more accurate results. So we don't have any interpretation, we don't have any leaking, and etc. So the minimum, by default, the minimum steps amount is 1. So if we have a static particle, we don't need to divide frame calculation, frame simulation for the steps, but sometimes we can go to 1000 steps per one frame. So I hope I think this very dramatically, but in fact, it's not all particles have those ability to have such many steps now. And we have the adaptivity allow us to define which particle will move with the lower steps amount, which particle will move with the higher steps amount, like here. So I don't want to change here nothing, but what I want to change, I want to change the time scale. So this is like a speed of the particle flow. That's all what we need to know about that. So the greater value is than 1, we are gonna we're gonna have the more speed for those particles. The less amount of 1, we're gonna slow down those particle simulations. So what I want to do, as I told you, I want to increase the time scales. So I want those make those particles move a little bit faster. So I want to increase this time scale to 2. I don't want to change the scale parameters, but I want to increase the particle, the time scale by multiplied by 2. All right, so liquid parameters, we don't need to in this moment. Emitter objects, we already have some stickiness here. I don't need to change to make change into our emitter geometry because, well, this is just a sphere. That's all what I need to do. Now go to collision object, and here's some interesting stuff we can change here. The thing is, if I want to change my particle amount, what I can do, I can go to my master voxel size, and as I did here, I can change it into the lower amount, so the lower size actually. So if I put like a 0.25, let's say I want to decrease the voxel size twice from 0.5 to 0.25. This means that we're going to have more cells, more voxels in our grid. And if this master voxel size, this means that we have an influence not just to liquid particles, we're going to have an influence on a geometry. So we have more voxels inside of our liquid and more voxels inside of our geometry. But the thing is, it will cause more simulation time. But what I want to do, I want to go to collision objects and I want to increase the voxel scale to like 2. So this is like a multiplier for our global size, right? I don't want to create a very detailed grid for my geometry. I think that it will be enough, like a 2 here for my voxel size, right? So is scaling factor for the master voxel size, right? So it's like a multiplicator. So if I have a 0.25 for my master voxel size, for geometry, I will have a 0.5. So basically for geometry, we don't have any change in here now. And another thing I can do here, we need to define the mode for our geometries. The thing is, we can have the closed geometry and open geometry. What this means, for those who don't know what this means, if you look on, let's say, a sphere, all right? Let me isolate this stuff and close this for a moment. We have a sphere. If you go into editable mesh or something like that to see the normals, if I go to polygons, select polygons, all I said, and press show normals. Now we can see that all our polygons have the outer size. So we have normals which are going from the polygon surface to the is actually going out from surface. So we have the closed geometry. There is no holes, no nothing, and all our polygons have the normals. This means this geometry is closed, and we can fill this geometry with some voxels. If it's, let's say, have a plane, if you add a plane here, again, go to isolation and go in here to edit mesh, select some polygons, turn off my normals, we can see that here on this side we have a normals. That means that this is our outer outer side of our polygons, but here we don't have a normals. This means that this is inside of our geometry, and actually we don't have a closed geometry, and we have geometry without any kind of volume. So this plane is thin. And the main problem using such thin geometries inside of our simulation is that, okay, need to delete it, is that we can't create a volume if geometry is not closed or it doesn't have any thickness. So to avoid such problem, we can use different methods. So in my case, if I look at my ground geometry, by default, it doesn't have any thickness too, because it's created just from simple cylinder with some stuff here, like noise and other things. And to include my geometry into my simulation, I need to create a volume from this thin geometry. And I add a shell modifier, which is allow us to create the thickness. So it adds some thickness here with like 1 meter, which is fine. So that means that this geometry is closed geometry and it have some thickness. All right. So the same stuff for my polygon. If I create a plane for my plane, and I want to use this plane inside of my simulation, I can use even two different methods. The first method is like here, I can use the shell modifier, and now I have the thickness, and when I go to edit mesh, I can definitely have the normal, so this all outward sides of my polygons. So now this mesh is good for liquid simulations. But anyway, what we can do inside of my liquid settings, we have two different modes. We have a solid mode, which is using for the volume objects like here, and we have the shell mode. If we want to use the shell mode, with this mode we can use the geometry which is thin, which don't have a thickness, like a planes or something. By default, our simulation program will add a thickness to each of those planes, and it will add a thickness like 1 unit. So in my case, it will add like 1 voxel for each thin object. In my case, what I could do, I can select my geometry and uncheck the shell. All right, so this geometry don't have a volume, and I can use the shell mode here, which is allow us to create the volume from the thin object. I have a very complex geometry, so in this case, if I will use the shell mode here, except of shell mode here, it will cause some leaking, because it's just thickness of 1. It means that it will create just the thickness of 1 voxel, but with some difference, heights here, with some curvatures, noising and other stuff, it will create some leaking, it will create some holes between those voxels. So to avoid such stuff, we need to increase the sequence like 2, 3, or even more to create the different voxels level. But sometimes, even if I create, let's say, a low res sim using the big voxel amount here, like 0.1, 0.5, 1, and etc., we're gonna create a nice simulation without any leaking. But when we create the high res, the final high res sim, we decrease the max voxel size to, let's say, 0.25, and that will cause the decreasing of the overall thickness of our thin geometry, and that's why it's gonna create some leaking again. And it's very bad when you spend like a day for simulation and then you came back and let's see, oh my god, we have a leaking because we decrease the voxel size. All right, so to avoid such stuff, I can create a shell modifier here into our geometry, and it will not it doesn't have any matters how big voxel we're going to use. We already have the thickness for my geometry, and this is 1 meter, and it will not depend of the master voxel size or something like that. So I prefer to use the solid mode here inside of simulation setup, and I prefer to use the shell modifier for all scene object in my scene. And another thing I can show you is how to use the different objects inside of one simulation. So let's say I have, come on, where's my plane? Where are you? Okay, here you go, plane. Come on. So I have a plane, maybe I need a little bit bigger plane. I have a plane from inside of my simulation, which is thin, it doesn't have a volume, and I have a volume object. So if I put my plane into collision object here, have a plane, it will add my plane into my collision objects into this list. And because we have a mode solid, it will apply this mode and to my volume geometry and to my thin plane. And in this case, it will cause some problems because it won't create volume using this plane or create a volume with very low thickness. So reason for that, we need to change the mode to shell for this plane only, not for all geometry objects, just for the plane. To do that, we go to plane 001 here on the list, and we can press the override global controls. So those parameters we have inside of collision object, we have like global parameters, and they're gonna have an influence in all geometry we have in colliding list, and for the ground and for the planes. But in my case, I want to override those global options to make some adjustment just for the plane. So this allows us to change the mode to the shell, except of the solid, and let's say I want to increase the thickness just in case 2 times bigger, so I want to avoid some leaking or something like that, so I will increase the thickness here to 2. And it's still gonna have the solid mode for the ground, but for the plane I'm gonna use the shell mode. Alright, so I will delete it, I don't need this stuff into my simulation. So, all right, now I will create this theme using the master voxel size like 0.25, and I'm gonna use the new thickness option here to create more friction for my liquid. And I already have this simulation, so all what I need to do is just to change my file caches, and this simulation is on my version 0.4. We have a liquid, solver, and you see that we have the same names, liquid 001, solver 01, and we have the voxel liquid. So it takes more time because I have the less voxel size, so this means that we're gonna have more particles. And I begin with almost 6 hours, and it finish with almost 1 hour. So it takes like 6 hours to cache 683 frames. All right, so now let's see how it looks. And in last example, I showed you how to use the new file caches by changing the name of my scene. So if I have the cache inside of folder liquid test 02 version 04, so I can definitely change my name to version 04, and as a last example, it will update to new file caches. But I want to show you another example how to do this without scene renaming. I can copy this folder name and go to simulation view and put this name except of the scene name variable. So it's look like the global variable scene name. We look on this scene name, and I want to paste here my name, liquid test 02 version 4, press enter, and I hope that I will update this liquid. Well, it's takes some time for updating because we're gonna have more particles. I want to look on the last frame and the voxel liquid and 683. All right, wow, we have a big amount of particles, 600, let's say 680. And I think that we're gonna use this, come on, let's wait for updating, this timeline. So I'm gonna go here and make the last frame like 680. Right, you need to wait a little bit. Come on. Now you can see that we definitely have the more particles now. And yeah, we have almost 2 million particles inside of this simulation. That's a huge amount of liquid. And I want to show you the preview for that scene, preview for this liquid. And now it looks way more better, not just with this liquid. I mean that the liquid have a more rest, it has more details. You can see that, oh, I have a stones here. I can show you what is it, how I can add those stones. So now we can see the nice interaction between the liquid and geometry. We have the nice vorticities, nice details here. And we see that some particles which are sliding on the geometry, they have more friction because we increase the thickness parameter here. And that's a little bit better seem. We still have some, you know, look like it's a huge amount of liquid, it's a huge volume because, you know, it's moving not very fast. It's look like it's very big scale simulation, which is good. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to have. And for stones, yeah, definitely need to add some stones. And to do that, I create a peer flow simulation, which is very, very simple. I just create a position object using my ground geometry, and position on this object, I placed on this object 400 particles and use the shape instance of those three. Where are they? My rock 1, 2, and 3. So there is 3 different type of rock. They are not too high polygon object because I didn't want to use many polygons for my simulation. So this is my stone group, right? And I use these stone groups as a shape instance for those particles with a little bit of random rotation and random scaling for the stones. So if I want to put my pure flow stones into my simulation, my liquid simulation, I need to create not a mesh, sorry, I need to create a stone mesh. And to do that, I use the mesh object, which we can here measure. I just rename it into stone mesh and select here inside of pick object, select my pure flow source. So now I'm gonna have all those stones like a mesh geometries. All right, this is our stones. And now I can add this stone mesh as a colliding object into my simulation for the liquid source here. Liquid attributes, and pick my stone mesh as a colliding object. So now my liquid will hit those stones and colliding with them. All right, so we already know how to work with the cache. We already know how to avoid some problems with the geometry and how to change our voxel size to find the proper voxel scale and particle amount. Now let's talk about the form. Each time we have such a global simulation, like a huge amount of water or liquid is falling down, we definitely need to add more details like a form, because mainly we're gonna create the mesh based of this simulation. And if you look on the particle, we have a nice detail like a splashes, droplets, and etc. But when we're gonna create the splash a little bit, create a mesh a little bit later, this mesh will be like a bubbly stuff, so it's just a geometry. And this liquid is gonna lose a little bit of detail, and to refine our liquid to add more details again, we need to create some secondary simulations like a form or splash particles to that. This method using different programs such as RealFlow, I know the Houdini, the same stuff is the Phoenix FD inside of Studio Max. We have the voxel simulation for the liquid, and we have some particle simulation for the foam and splash. So I turn off my liquid sim here, so I don't want to resimulate this liquid again. Okay, I like this core liquid, and now I want to create the foam based on this pre-cached simulation. And how to do that? Well, we definitely need to turn on our solve form button here, and we need to look on our timeline. The thing is, if we, let's say, have the timeline like 1000, okay, let's say 1000, as we did earlier. Again, need to take some time because it's just drag our slider. Okay. And if you press this button, there just be a solve warning. To solve form or generate a mesh, the liquid cache must be complete. Please activate the liquid solve option. This means that we have the 1000 frames in our timeline, but we have just 683 frames already calculated. So we don't have a cache for all our timeline frames. So to create the splashes, to create a form, actually, we need to go to our timeline, and I want to change my end animation time to frame where we have the simulation cached files. Come on. Okay. So now, if we have the old timeline with cached files, we can't see this visually, but we can understand. So if we have the last frame like 683, so definitely 680, we have this. And if we go in here to start solve, and if we just go to this button, we can see that solve form component, and the next line is cache complete. This means that we have a complete cache in our timeline, and when we start our simulation, it will create the nice form for us. So the thing is, we go to form parameters, and we can find here many different preferences and many different stuff for the form. And even more, if we go to advanced mode, we can see that there are definitely more parameters for the form. So definitely we have more parameters for the form than for the liquid, and the reason for that, we can create a form in different situations. Sometimes for the low res sim or for the low scale simulation like a beer or something like that, and in other cases we can create a form from the huge ship going in the water surface. So we have many different situations, and in those situations sometimes we need to play with the liquid depths or the form depths or form volume to create the nice thickness for this form, like in a glass of beer or something. Sometimes we need to create a nice pattern form like from the ship. Okay, so in different situations we need to make changes in different parameters. So in our case, I want to use the basic mode. All right, so what we have here, we have the main parameters, which just allow us to define where and how many form I will create. So how many form, actually the form emission rate we have here by default, it's like 1000. And we have the thresholds for the form, and these thresholds we have the speed, churn, and liquid curvature. So those minimum thresholds for the creation. All right, so how we can create the liquid, how we can create a form in real world where form is created. Well, if we look on, I don't know, like a water surface, there is no form because by default water surface have just like waves, and this static, this liquid is almost static. We create a form when liquid is hitting something, or something is going in water surface like a shape again, or something like that. So the form creates when liquid became more active, when we have some dynamics, when we have some hitting, curvature, speed, and etc. So basically using those parameters, we can define where we can create the form stuff. So to create the form, liquid needs to have some speed. All right, when the particle is static, doesn't move in any way, it doesn't create this form. Why it has to create a form now? So we have the minimum liquid speed for form creation, minimum liquid term. So there is meter per second based on rotation and angular momentum in the liquid. All right, so between 0 and 2, okay, the lower parts emit in more form, the bigger values emit less form. So the less minimum threshold we create here, the more form going to be created, because the more particles will go through these thresholds and will create the form. All right, so basically what I want to do for now, I just want to leave those parameters by default and just to look how we can, how many form we're going to create in this example. So the thing is, I just press the play button to see what is the result without any changing, and we're going to look on some changing. We're going to look how it works, and then we can define, okay, so lower rate, bigger rate, what thresholds we need to change, because we need to see our previous simulation. All right, so I press the play button and we're gonna see the result, and that's the result. If I go to display settings, I turn on the display type for the form settings, like a points, like we did with the liquid. And we have almost the same settings for the particles. We have the size, which I want to put like a 0.1 as I did for the liquid. And we have the same stuff like a color channel, we have the opacity channel, etc. What we don't have, we have the color grid, like here for minimum to maximum, because, basically for form, we don't need to see this, the form velocity or something like that. Form is just a form. All right, so what I want to do, I want to see how many form do I have. So in this example, I have a pretty big form amount. We have this almost, if you go into last frame, I want to see how many forms I have in the last frame. And basically in my global, in my such big volume simulation, the big scale simulation, this form amount is, I think, is good in this case. But we definitely need to change some parameters if we're gonna have some different setups. So I'm gonna render this thing like it is, like it's here, and I want to make some changes for my liquid and to look on the form there. All right, so what I want to do, I want to set up some render stuff here, and then I want to just create another solver. Or actually, let's do first off, I want to do two different simulations, and then we're going to talk about rendering. All right, so how we can do different simulation? Well, the first step, the first method is, I think, the most simplest way is just to create a new scene here. So file, save as, create a new version or with a new name. And if you have a new name, put here on the cache files, scene name, and etc. So each time you will change your scene name, each time you're going to have the new folder for caching. All right, so in this situation, what I want to do, I want to create another solver. So we can easily go here, press the right mouse button. And as one thing I want to show you, if we, let's see, change some settings here inside of form parameters or different parameters inside of our simulation view, if you want to make this parameter by default, I don't remember what our liquid speed by default, we can go here, press the control button and press the right mouse button on this area, and we will make this parameter by default. So if we put some different changes here, like 0.1, 0.5, 0.1, and then I want, all right, I don't like this result. I want to make those parameters back to default. So control right mouse button, and we back all those parameters as they was. All right, so now we go to solver and press the right mouse button, and I want to clone this solve object. So now I have a solver point 1 copy. I want to rename it and make it solver 01, and I don't know how to call it. Go to low res, or not a low res, low scale, so LS. So I want to create the same simulation but with the lower scale for that. How can I do this? In fact, when I create, okay, let's see, I want to put this like 1 for faster result, and that's it, just 1, and go uncheck this, check here liquid simulation, because I don't have a liquid simulation for my LS version. Yeah, I have the same cache, let's see, and I play. All right, I make a new liquid simulation. If I go to the folders, going here, liquid test 2 version 4, I would have a new folder with the beginning of the theme. It's okay, it starts. Now we go to this folder, and yeah, we have a new folder called solver 01 LS, and we have the different liquids here and different solids. Okay, we begin with a new liquid. So now inside of one scene, inside of one liquid 001 object, I have 2 different solvers with 2 different setups. So I have different settings for each solver. All right, the same method I can use, let's say, for the high res result and for the low res result. Each time I switch between those solvers, I can see the different setups, different particle simulation, and etc. So now we have like frame 14 and etc. So inside of one scene, we can try to test different parameters without losing the information of the another solve. All right. So in this case, what I want to do, I want to change, you know what I want to change? I want to change the scale. So if I go here to my customized unit setup and system unit setup, if I choose like in 1 centimeters here, it will change the scale for all my scene and for both solvers, because I make changes not inside of simulation view, not inside of solver settings, I make a change inside of the overall scene. So I don't want to do this. I want to make changes inside of each solver. So let's see, I just want to make some test. All right, I want to decrease this height of this object from 80 meters to, let's say, it's like 4 meters. Okay, so except of 1 meters, if I put 1 centimeters, it will create a very low amount. Okay, so let me set up 1 unit is 5 centimeters. If I put 5 centimeters, it will have not 80 meters, it will have 4 meters. All right, so if I put to my system unit setup that 1 unit, it's not 1 meter, it's 5 centimeters. This means that it will be 20 times lower. All right, so from 80 meters, it will be just 4 meters. All right, that will be good. So now I want to create a simulation like this geometry is 4 meters high. Okay, so you just want to, all right, 1 meters, I don't know, I just clicked this by mistake. All right, so now you see I make changes and my solver is stopped because I changed my global scales. I don't want to do this. All right, so I'm going to simulation parameters here, and I want to change my unit system scale from 1 unit to 5 centimeters. Okay, press enter. So I'm gonna still have the same system unit scale for my solver 1, but I want to change it for solver 2. All right. Okay, simulation parameter. Now I have 1 unit is 5 centimeters. Okay. So now with this sim, I just want to look how it looks. You just want to play this simulation, and I want to make a pause. I want to restart because, okay, master voxel size. Let's see. I put 0.4 for the master voxel size. And with the time scale, I put 1 because I don't need to speed up my simulation. I already have 20 less scale, so it will create more higher speed for my liquid because it now have a 4-meter height except of 80 meters. So change my time scale to 1 as by default, and actually for my geometries I will use the same settings. All right, now let's see what do we have here. And now we have this seam, and you can see that we have a definitely different kind of simulation. So all what we change here is just the voxel size a little bit and change our system scale. Right, from the system scale, we change our unit to 5 centimeters except of 1 meter. And now we have the big volume as the big liquid speed, and we change time scale back to 1, and we still have a very fast liquid moving. So now it's look more like a string or something except of a river. All right, now I want to put some form here, and to do that I'm going to form parameters, and now we have a less curvy liquid. So if we go here to our solver 01, we have a more high res seam with a big amount of particle, and we have more, you know, different vorticities here. Come on, turn on. Oh, this is a different scale now. All right, doesn't matter. It will update. And the thing is, if we go into form parameters, we need to decrease those thresholds to have a bigger form amount. And to do that, I will increase the emission rate to like 1500 actually. 1500, and decrease all 3 thresholds twice. So I put 0.1 for the speed, the charm like 0.5, and 0.15 for the curvature. That will increase the form amount for me. Right? Now go into form and play again my simulation to see how many forms I'm gonna get. And now we're back again. Now we can see that, well, it's not 1 million form I have, but, well, definitely 185,000 particles for form is pretty nice for the simulation. We have already 600,000 particles for now, so that's pretty good. All right, so let's go to creating the mesh and visualize all this stuff. And to do that, I'm going here to meshes. And again, I want to create the default mesh for that. So I can turn off my form settings and play my simulation to create a mesh. All right, we finished the simulation, and well, actually I create my mesh without any settings changing, just press this button. Now we want to see how it looks. And to do that, we go to Bifrost Cache Mesh. So now it will display my liquid not as a particle, but as a mesh. Let's take some time. Come on. And have a result with our mesh. So we use the default settings you can see here, and we have a few different parameters we can refine, we can change for creating the mesh liquid as we want. In fact, we create this mesh like in blind because I don't see those parameters. I just press play and I create this mesh with default settings. And I did this because I want to see the difference between the default caches and cache I can create with some changing stuff here. To see the changes, we can select not a Bifrost cache mesh, because with this setup we can see the final result, the result of our simulation, and we can render our simulation out. So to refine my cache, I need to select a Bifrost dynamic mesh. So using this method, we can refine or change our parameters, and we would see those changing in our mesh. So see here we can see that we have the same settings as in a Bifrost cache mesh. So what we can do here, we have some droplet reveal factor, as you can see here with the description. Come on, show me that. Show me this. Okay, so lower values result in smoother meshes, while higher values give more small, higher frequency detail. So we can exclude or include some droplets into our mesh creating. So with the droplets, we see that some particles fly away from the main core simulation. They create some droplets. So we can include those droplets into our mesh creating, or we can exclude the stuff of that. So to see the changing here, we can, let's say, put it like a 1, except of 3. So it's going to create a more smoother result to extrude some droplets from the mesh creation. And we have the surface radius is one of the main parameters we can adjust here. When we create a mesh, we take all our particles and we create something like a spheres based on each of those particles, and then we create like a skin between those spheres, like a metaballs or something. So with the lower values for those surface radius, we create more thinner result, but it can create some holes. Okay, we can add some holes because the mesh became a little bit thinner than it was. So to see this result of some dramatical things like 0.5, I just put here, and you can see the result with a radius of 0.5. And now you can see that it's definitely not that what we want, because now we have many different holes between those particles, and we have a very, very noisy result. So again, with the bigger radius, we're going to have a more smooth result. But with the big radius, we're going to have a very very shallow, with a big more thick surface. Yes, we're gonna have more, like a smooth surface, but with this radius, well, it's more interesting results. Sometimes it goes interesting results. All right, we have a droplet radius. This is another one radius just for those particles which are droplets. Again, with like a droplet reveal factor, we can include those particles or can exclude those. So let's back droplet reveal factor to 3.0, and I decrease the droplet radius to like 0.5 to exclude those droplets even more from my simulation. We have a kernel factor. Again, this works like with the core simulation, and with the lower result, we're gonna have more smoother features, and with the higher curvatures, with the high result, we're gonna have some more curvy mesh. Well, smoothing is talking like themselves, so the more smoothing parameters, the more values we have, the more smoothing level we're gonna use for that. It's like a smoothing factor in many meshes, like a turbo smooth or smooth meshes. So it's not to use the particles, it will use like a pre-smoothing the mesh. So it's create the mesh using those settings we already set up here, and that it will add some smoothing level to this mesh. So if I put like a smoothing 1, we're going to have a very noisy, sometimes it creates a very noisy result, and this liquid is not such perfect as we want, because it's create blinking. Liquid is very reflective stuff, so if we will render that, we're going to have a reflective and refractive surface. So in this case, we have, you see these details. Sometimes when you create a water surface, we need to increase the smoothing, because we want to have a nice flat surfaces or nice flat waves. And sometimes we need to create more, noisy waves to add more details, to make this scene more interesting, to add water more interesting. Well, resolution factor is very simple stuff. If you go into F4, we can see how many polygons we have. It's pretty wide. We even can see the wireframe, but if you go to object properties, we can see that we have like almost 1 million faces for the now. So we have a resolution factor is 1. The more resolution factor we have, more resolution we're gonna have on the final, so more polygons gonna use for the mesh creation. So if we have a highly detailed surface, we definitely need to create more polygons. Well, in this case, I think that resolution 1 is more than enough because we have a pretty simple liquid mesh, and 1 million polygons is more than enough in this case. But sometimes when we have a huge water surface, we need to refine this parameter to find the gold middle with the render time, because you need to keep in mind that always when you increase the resolution for each of your meshes, you will increase the calculation time, because you can now see that we spent a little bit more time for creating this mesh with a resolution factor of 1.5 than we did with the resolution of 1.0, and we're gonna spend more time for calculation of all those frames. We're gonna spend more space because it will take more space for each frame cache, and it will take more render time because you have a more detailed result, more polygons. Now we have like an vertices. Sorry, we have like 2.2 million polygons now for this result. I think that is too much. Well, we definitely have a little bit more details in there, but I think that I will keep it like 1 and create a smoothing maybe like 2. So 3 in this case, maybe a little bit more than I want, but 2 is gonna be good. And hole kills threshold is a parameter allow us to kill some holes. So delete sometimes if you want to create nice smooth surface like a milk or something like that, and sometimes we have like gaps between the particles, and it will create some holes in a mesh. So we can kill some holes, so fill those holes with geometry, with the mesh, and these parameters allow us to do that. In my case, I don't want to do that. All right, so I have a mesh. So now I set up all my parameters and settings here, and now I need to send those parameters to my cache mesh, because when I create a cache again, I need to recalculate it again. And if I press this solve button, it will take these parameters, not those. All right, this will update again. So I need to drag those parameters to my new cache mesh stuff. So it's take a while. Right, so here are 3, 2.5, 0.5, 2, 2, 1. So actually by default I leave my droplet reveal factor, and I change my surface radius to 2.5, change my droplet radius to 0.5. Actually I can leave it like 1.5 in my case. I want to create more thin liquid. So all what I need to do is just to change droplet radius to 0.5, change the smoothing to 2, and actually that's it. I'll leave those parameters by default as that was. Yeah, definitely need to create more thinning result. All right, good. So go to cache mesh. That's a strange word, cache mesh. Yeah, 1.5 for the surface radius, except of 1.4 by default. Come on. So now 1.5. So now I don't need to wait, because it will not affect on this mesh, because it's cache mesh. It will have an effect when I press this button. So now I press this button, and oh, not a complete mesh because I didn't 550, right? So in my situation, I create the simulation just with 550 frames, because with the higher speed, the liquid is fill this pool a little bit faster, so I don't need to calculate all 800 frames or 600 frames, it will still have like 550. All right, get back to my, and let's check it. Cache complete, nice. All right, so choose my solver. I want to enable my solver ls. And with this option enable, create a mesh, I want to play this button. And let's wait a little bit to create mesh with those parameters. And the last one, last thing I want to show is just how to visualize our simulation result to have a nice picture. And here we go with render setup. I'm going to render settings here. And what I want to do, in fact, inside of render settings, all what we have is the liquid main setup. What we have is liquid settings and form settings. Well, we can add some channels here, except the velocity. We can put here in the nage, churn density, vorticity, etc. stuff if you want to. And by default, we have 2-in-1. So we have two different objects inside of one liquid or one object. We have the mesh for the liquid and we have the particles for the form. Basically, you could try different setups, different visualizations, different methods for rendering. I want to use the Arnold here because by default form settings set up here like an render particles like an Arnold points. In different liquid simulation program or plugins, I use a different method using the V-Ray, using Krakatoa for particles. So V-Ray for meshes, you can define what you want to do, what you want to have. But if you have an Arnold inside of Swedish to the Max 2018, we can use this nice visualization feature for creating a nice picture here. So what I want to do, I put the low-res HDTV, so just 1000 for the width. And with Arnold's render setup, I have basically almost the default stuff except of camera AA. I put like a 6 sample for that. And with the system, it's nothing more like I have an AOV here, and I put inside of EXR file the diffuse channel with direct specular ZDAPs, motion vector, object, opacity, and transmission to have an ability to change or to refine my render picture inside of Nuke or any compositing program you want to use. So I just want to say for a moment, I want to make just simple render. The thing is, what changes we need to make to have a nice result here. Well, for the mesh, we don't have any kind of settings, so we can use the cache mesh we create with those parameters we did earlier. And but with the particles, we can use how we will render those particles, what channel we're going to use for that. And here we're going to have some density radius channels. So we can choose what channel we're going to use. So actually we can use a static. This means that we will render all those particles with a radius by default it's 0.2. Or we can use like a density channel to define if the particle is going to have the less density, it's going to have the less radius, something like that. So by default radius is 0.2. So what I can do, I can make just a default render. But before I do this, I want to explain how we can apply materials to our geometries or to our liquids. So by default, I put some materials here on the background, on the rock. With water, we use this very interesting method. So to make a liquid, I create the physical material here with the reflections and transparency set to 1. With the reflection is white, and with transparency just add a little bit of bluish tint here. And we need to play a little bit with the depths. So depths allow us to control what is the depths you're going to have for the lighting. So if you put, let's say, 0.1 meter, we're gonna have a more dense result, more color. Even with, you see, you don't even see that there is some bluish tint here. Yeah, you see that it's slightly blue, but the less dense we have, the less parameters we're going to use here, the less the more color we'll have in the result. So what distance will pass the lights when it's creates the color. So in my case, I'm going to use like 0.75. I need to create just a slightly bluish tint for my liquid. And for the foam, I will use just a simple white physical material. Simply white, without any transparency, reflection, or something like that. Just the white basic color. And if we apply the both material to one object, like a liquid 001 in our case, we need to create a multi-sub object material. So we have a multi-sub object with the first ID 1, we put our liquid material, and to ID 5 we put our foam material, and then I apply this material to my liquid mesh, okay, to my actually liquid 001 object. And so now I want to render one frame to see how it looks. I want to see how it looks my foam and liquid. Maybe I need to change something in form settings. And here we begin with the render. And I see that we definitely need to decrease the radius. I want to decrease the density of my particles, foam particles, because now I see from here, even with GI render, GI pass, I see that my foam is too dense here. I need to decrease the density for the foam. Well, it's not bad, but yeah, I want to decrease a little bit of density. Cancel that. And again, go to simulation view, go here and put a radius 0.1 or like 0.075, something like that. Again, go to render. Now we have less, a little bit less white colors here. Now more bluish tones. This means that we have a less dense particles, less dense foam particles, which is good. Just wait a little bit, make a pause. Yeah, that's definitely better. If you look at our liquid mesh and particles, this looks more natural. And that's what we have in the final result. This render made with a density of 0.075. There's no color correction, that's just beauty pass. Render it with Arnold. So it's pretty nice result. We have like tiny string here. Streamlit or real. And it's nice to have a feeling the pool with water. And a nice form here. Now I want to show you another result. It's our render of a first simulation we created earlier. And with this simulation, if you look on the render, I just create some background render as it is, as here. And I add a little bit, I decrease the density of my particle even more to 0.05, because in this example we have many foam particle. As you remember, it's more than 1 million particle was created with the first simulation. And to avoid like white water, I decreased the density of our particle to reduce to 0.05, and it's create a little bit more nicer result. And with this I add a motion vector to create a little bit more like a vector blur, maybe less a little bit, and merge with the background, and this result we have for our first simulation. So this water looks like more with a more bigger scale. Yes, look like it's a huge amount of water falling down like a waterfall. It's separated into pieces. You know, if we have in this compare those results, come on, we have like a tiny string here. So in this result we have the large water simulation with the different pieces of water falling down, so it's separated into different waves or something like that. And we have a nice form here when it hits the pool with the water, and we have a nice amount of detail, which is good. Many vorticities here, many detail. Right, so as you can see, we create our simulation without any difficult settings, so we don't change too many stuff, we don't use something very hard like an strange parameters. All what we need is just to have a deal with voxel size. That's the first thing we need to deal with, because it will have influence on the particle amount we use inside of our simulation. We need to have a deal with our system scale. So what units we gonna have, so what water we want to use, the large scale sim or low scale sim. So those settings we need to define first, and then we can deal with the form setup, we can deal with the mesh result we need to have. So this is just first part of our lessons. In the next chapter I want to show you how to work with some viscosity simulation to create simulation like a chocolate, something like that. And in another part, sure, we're gonna talk about container for creating the water surfaces. So let's stay with us and see ya in the next lessons.